For those of you who just joined us, we're waiting just a minute before our host, Dennis Speed, is talking to one of the presenters tonight. So just please stand by.
Charles, I'm sorry. I just gave Bill the code. So have you started this yet? I hope not.
Nope. You tell me when you want to start, and I'll start the record.
Let's go.
The recording has started.
My name is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to welcome you to tonight's action-packed call. There have been all kinds of events in the United States this week, and worldwide, of course, but there is something momentous that has begun over the course of the past roughly 10 days. There's an actual impeachment process, so-called. There's a formal impeachment process, I should say, the third in the nation's history. This is itself kind of the projection of a much larger international fight. It's a fight between what President Donald Trump has referred to as the patriots versus the globalists. It's a fight that has deeper roots in America, and it has roots particularly from the inflection point of what is often referred to as 9/11, September 11th, 2001. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to do three things for you. First, we're going to discuss, of course, the events of the recent days, but from the standpoint not of current events, but from the standpoint of current history. And I think the way we're going to be addressing these things will define for you what the difference is between the two. The second thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be giving you, the citizens, a way of addressing these events, which are of an international and historic type, but in a way that gives you a handle on how you can have a decisive effect in altering those events. The third thing we're going to do is to provide the broader, if you will, meta context, that being that there is a financial crisis that looms around and surrounds the entirety of this, and there's also a cultural crisis that also is impacting the entirety of what we're undergoing. And so we're dealing with important, in-depth philosophical matters, but we're dealing with them in a very tangible way that causes the American citizen to be right at the center of them, even though, of course, we are not going to ignore the international implications or the international context. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start off with our first speaker tonight, who is Barbara Boyd. She will be giving you many different, of course, the context of what's going on. But we'll start with her, and we'll follow her with Larry Johnson, who you've all, I think, are familiar with, former CIA analyst. And then Bill Binney will speak with us. Then we'll be going pretty fast, actually, tonight, right to questions, comments, commentary. And so get ready, because we're about to create a basis for a kind of evaluation I don't think you're usually able to get. So, Barbara, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So, look, folks, yesterday, Wednesday, we saw a really, truly historic U.S. Senate hearing where the Inspector General of the United States Department of Justice, Michael Horowitz, answered questions about a report he issued on Monday involving what can only be described as the gross misconduct by the FBI and the Department of Justice in the really international campaign to prevent the election of Donald Trump and then to remove him. That is the coup which has been ongoing here since the November 2016 election. Now, today, we have the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, in the House Judiciary Committee, working late. It's going on right now. They're marking up articles of impeachment of Donald Trump. These articles, which, if accepted as is and voted up by the Senate, resulting in a conviction of the president, would turn our constitutional republic literally into a British parliamentary system. It has nothing to do with the impeachment clause as written by the founders. if you can impeach him for the types of policy differences, style differences, and the phone call between Trump and President Zelensky, then what you've gone to is something akin to the British parliamentary system, where the president becomes a figurehead and he serves at the pleasure of the United States Senate. The primary beef about this impeachment is over that which distinguishes this presidency from kings, monarchs, or anybody else. It's Article 2 of the Constitution, giving the president the authority to conduct foreign policy of the United States. So what could happen if this thing is seen through as envisioned by the Democrats is that we could finally be turned formally into something which people think already probably exists. That is, that we will be controlled by a financial oligarchy, like most of the parliaments in Europe are controlled, centered in the central banks in the City of London. We'd be a modern imperial entity administered by academics, technocrats, and mandarins, like all empires in history, and like nothing our founders could ever imagine us becoming. Now, the tool for the control of current modern empires is, as in George Orwell's 1984, mass surveillance, outright control of popular opinion, manipulation of popular opinion, and a cultural inducement in the population of kind of like a cult-like ignorance where political divides are accentuated and manipulated based essentially on identity politics. On August 23rd of this year, Mark Carney, who is the current darling central banker of the British Empire, called for precisely this form of fascism to be implemented immediately here and across the world using the Green New Deal as the mechanism to achieve it. He called for a dictatorship, literally, at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, by central bankers and technocrats to handle what will invariably follow from what he envisions as a financial collapse of the Western system. His basic call for such a form of fascism is going to be echoed repeatedly by the presidential candidacy of Michael Bloomberg, who just entered the race and is spending millions in an outright attempt to buy the presidency. That's the political situation we're facing. However, there's a huge reversal of everything that we've had going on for 3.5 years based on what happened before the Senate Judiciary Committee yesterday. Despite a huge and massive media campaign of lies preceding the release of the Horowitz report on the activities of the FBI and Department of Justice against Donald Trump, what Horowitz describes, forget about all of the language which you've seen in the press or any place else, what he presents is a devastating expose of a massive abuse of power by the Department of Justice and the FBI. If you haven't yet, please go to the LaRouchePAC website and listen to Lindsey Graham in his 40-minute opening statement yesterday to Michael Horowitz prior to his testimony. And watch the second video LaRouchePAC posted yesterday of Senators Grassley, Cornyn, Mike Lee, and Ted Cruz questioning Horowitz about the significance of what he found. Hopefully, you will get a sense of the magnitude of all of this, which I can only describe as a historic game changer, an opening to what is also about to come down the pike from John Durham, who is investigating in a much larger context than Michael Horowitz. Now, what Horowitz found was that the Department of Justice and the FBI procured surveillance warrants on Carter Page, a volunteer for the Trump campaign, by committing multiple frauds on the judges of the FISA surveillance court, and more significantly, frauds on the American public. I'm going to focus tonight on the two main frauds found by Horowitz. The first fraud is that the FBI knew that the Christopher Steele dossier, for those who don't know it, that's the relatively infamous dossier compiled by the former MI6 agent for the Hillary Clinton campaign against Donald Trump. It was paid for by the Clinton campaign, and it became almost the sole foundation from which all of the allegations about Trump and Russiagate flowed. And basically what the Inspector General of the United States Department of Justice found was that the FBI and the DOJ knew that this dossier, the Steele report, was a complete fraud as of January 2017, when they interviewed the main Russian source for all of Christopher Steele's lies about Donald Trump and Russia. This was the Russian who the Horowitz report says gathered all of the rest of the stuff which makes up the dirty dossier, which was the foundation of the entire Russiagate, coup attempt. And what this guy told the FBI in January of 2017 was that Christopher Steele's dossier consisted entirely of unverified barroom gossip, rumor, and bullshit. I'm saying bullshit because that's the only way that you can describe it. Obviously, Inspector General Horowitz didn't say that. Lindsey Graham said it, however, calling it total crap, and the FBI knew it. Now, the FBI wanted to spy on Trump's campaign, so they needed a warrant to spy on one of the campaign's volunteers. Bill Binney will tell you tonight about how one FISA warrant can get you through the door to the entire campaign. They chose Carter Page for the FISA warrant because he had a previous involvement with the FBI in an espionage case, and because Christopher Steele had lied that Carter Page was the gopher for Paul Manafort in dealings between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. The only problem with this was that Carter Page was not a pawn of the Russians, as Christopher Steele claimed. He was actually an operational source of the CIA and was reporting his contacts with the Russians to them. When the FBI, the Justice Department, and Christopher Steele all leaked Carter Page's name to the news media here in the Russiagate media frenzy and accused Carter Page essentially of being a Russian spy, Carter Page responded and said publicly, wait a second, I am reporting my Russian contacts to both the FBI and the CIA. The CIA sent an email to the FBI saying, hey, this guy is an operational source of ours. And an FBI lawyer by the name of Kevin Kleinsmith changed the email to say that Carter Page was not a CIA source. Now, obviously, Carter Page being a CIA source undermines the claim in the FISA warrant, the main claim in the spy warrant, which they got on the Trump campaign, that Carter Page was somehow a Russian agent. So the FBI and the Justice Department, based on the Horowitz report, can now definitively and provably be said to know that as of January 2017, when they interviewed Christopher Steele's main source, that all of it was bogus, that all of it was nonsense, that there was no collusion, as they called it, between the Russians and Donald Trump, no matter how hard British intelligence, the Obama White House, and John Brennan's CIA pushed that lie. End of story. There was nothing further to investigate after that, except, of course, how the hell did all this begin in the first place? Yet, at the very same time, in January of 2017, the U.S. intelligence community issued its assessment that Russia intervened in the election to elect Donald Trump. And we now know that that completely bogus Steele dossier played a significant role in that assessment, despite numerous previous denials under oath by Brennan and Clapper that it did not. The very same Steele dossier was used by James Comey in an attempt to entrap and blackmail the President-elect of the United States in a briefing in January of 2017, and then to smear Donald Trump as compromised by Putin because of tapes Christopher Steele claimed Putin had of Donald Trump's perverse sexual activities. It was all fake. A huge and outrageous lie for which there are few parallels in history and none that I could find involving our nation. Attorney General Barr commented on this in 2 interviews this week. He said the country had been turned inside out for 3.5 years based essentially on information which all the people involved knew was bullshit, although he used much gentler terms. A big lie which was fanned and assisted by a lying and complicit media. They knew in January of 2017, if you accept the proposition that the FBI did not know that it was all a lie from the beginning. Yet they proceeded with the entire effort to set the president up on obstruction and other crimes, out of which came the brutal and ridiculous Mueller witch hunt, and now the equally insane Ukraine-gate impeachment proceedings. As Lindsey Graham said last night on Sean Hannity's show, the door Horowitz has opened will be gone through. Lindsey Graham looked right at the cameras and he said, Rod Rosenstein, get ready to testify. Now, there's a whole lot more revealed by the Horowitz report, mostly by what is not there. That is why Attorney General Barr and John Durham are contesting Horowitz's conclusions, and much of that goes to what Bill Binney, Larry Johnson, and other members of the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity have proved. The premise for the Horowitz report involves acceptance of the very big lie that the Russians hacked the DNC and John Podesta and turned the results over to WikiLeaks, and that was the Russian interference which has led to the complete collapse of U.S.-Russian relationships despite the president's best efforts to keep lines of communication open. The hack of the DNC by the Russians resulting in the WikiLeaks documents is a provable lie, and Bill Binney and his friends have proved it. The Horowitz report also fills out and confirms much of what we have published about Christopher Steele and the circles he runs in. We said at the beginning of this whole mess that if you follow the Steele thread in the coup against Trump, you would be opening doors to truly evil and international operations, and that trail would lead you to the heart of the enemy and most of the intelligence crimes committed in the last 4 decades. Christopher Steele is a protege of Sir Richard Dearlove and his intelligence circle in London. Christopher Steele is Dearlove's protege. That is the circle, for instance, which sold the Iraq War to George Bush. Steele has a history of conducting information warfare operations, black propaganda, which our intelligence agencies surely knew, even if the FBI claims it didn't know. His bogus Trump reports followed services performed for Victoria Nuland, John Kerry, and the British government in fomenting the Nazi coup in Ukraine. His business, Orbis Business Intelligence, is a fairly obvious intelligence front. Its clients are mostly rival Russian oligarchs who Steele assists in various litigations conducted in London, where they go to court against each other, and Steele profiles them and gathers information from the very same oligarchs in order to undermine Putin. According to the Horowitz report, Steele even tried to turn some of these oligarchs into FBI informants, a very interesting tale which is yet to be publicly told. Steele was the handler for the person who was at one time the most famous anti-Putin oligarch, Boris Berezovsky, before he ended up dead, and the case agent in the 2006 Litvinenko poisoning, which kicked off London's current war drive against Russia. Pablo Miller, an individual associated with Steele's Orbis firm, was the handler for Sergei Skripal, the most recent victim of British intelligence hoaxes involving Russia. You might recall that Skripal was poisoned in a hoax attributed to the Russians last March. Just prior to undertaking his assignment against Trump, Steele prepared bogus reports claiming that the Brexit vote was manipulated by the Russians and that the Russians were intervening in all elections in Europe. So don't take seriously the after-the-fact claims by British intelligence that they have now found Christopher Steele lacked judgment or was untrustworthy. Their operation was beginning to blow up when they claimed this and has just been incinerated by the implications of the Horowitz report. In fact, Christopher Steele himself has taken great issue with the FBI for calling him an informant who violated FBI media protocols when he talked to the press. By the FBI's account, that's why they fired him. Christopher Steele has released a statement through his lawyers here saying that he made it perfectly clear who he was and what he was up to. To wit, he was a guy who was in the black propaganda business, and the FBI accepted a contract with his firm for that very purpose. The Horowitz report confirms that that was indeed the understanding. So this is all really quite stunning. It is a trail which, if properly handled, can, as I said before, expose most of the intelligence crimes of the past 4 decades. Now, when we were talking about this call, we talked about what is involved in taking this whole thing down at this point. The door is open, clearly. It's an opportunity. And we talked a little bit about what's the overall strategic situation in which this is occurring. And Bill Binney, I think, said to Dennis that the present situation internationally is really a war between a defined enemy which is fighting to preserve its empire internationally at all costs, and those who are breaking free from that empire, however consciously, and its oligarchical axioms about human beings. Since Roosevelt's death, the United States has gradually corrupted and degraded itself in the direction of oligarchical rule. A smug elite sits at the top and dictates rules of behavior both by law and custom, which results in large swaths of the population being treated no better, really, than human cattle. The sharp turn for the worse began with the Kennedy and King assassinations and the Vietnam War, and really got rolling when Nixon finally killed the Bretton Woods system in 1971, and opening the door thereby to the twin evils of globalization and massive speculation under the rubric of free trade. If you want some insight into what an oligarchy is and what we're discussing here, you should read Friedrich Schiller's essay about Lycurgus and Solon, available from the Schiller Institute, and the off-sided and fully developed view of that in Lyndon LaRouche's essay, The Coming Eurasian World. As Dennis emphasized, the most recent notable points in this descent were the terror attacks of 9/11 and the Iraq War. Lyndon LaRouche cites the British Secret Services and Zbigniew Brzezinski and Samuel Huntington as the intellectual authors of the modern permanent warfare regime and the unaccountable administrative bureaucratic apparatus warring against the president now, what has been referred to as the deep state. Bill Binney and Larry were shouting from the rooftop shortly after 9/11 about the surveillance state which was being implemented then and its consequences which we now see playing out in the attempted coup against the sitting president of the United States and the intended wholesale transformation of the nation being led by the crazy Jacobins right now who are temporarily possessed with madness, the temporary Jacobins of the Democratic Party. The Horowitz report and the Judiciary Committee hearing on yesterday are I am convinced, the first step in changing all of that, really all of it. The surveillance state itself is under widespread attack and condemnation. Yesterday, senators who have sworn a blood oath to the surveillance state were saying that they would now join Mike Lee in thinking about getting rid entirely of the FISA court. The guardians of the empire, the news media, and Hollywood culture have really lost all credibility with the population as a result of their campaign of lies against this president. This entire apparatus has been desperate and reckless and now stand partially exposed and about to be fully exposed as liars and crooks. Most importantly, we have a president who is willing to fight and to disrupt. Lyndon LaRouche writes about the causes and solutions to political crises as follows, and I quote him, "Usually, unfortunately, the mistaken assumption has been made that the previous crisis was the result of the violation of some traditional set of values, when, in fact, it was caused by a failure to carry out a needed violation of that very set of values. The false assumption is, therefore, that the solution exists within the set of assumptions which has generated the crisis in the first place. This, at heart, is the deadly and popular malady which this president abrasively disrupts on behalf of those forgotten Americans our elites call deplorables. If we join him in disrupting the right way, if we embrace the bold programmatic view of looking at the future, the next 50 years for what it could be, and begin to implement that based on LaRouche's programs, this coup can clearly now be stopped. And I will let Bill and Larry elaborate more than I've covered here.
Hey, Barbara, thanks. Larry, we're going to go to you because you've been writing every day about this, and you've had some colorful headlines recently to some of your articles. So let's go right to you, and then we'll go to Bill, and then we'll open up for conversation. Go ahead.
Okay. The Horowitz report provided the definitive answer as to how the FBI investigation was launched, in theory, at least the cover story. And that is that third-hand hearsay about a person who was no longer part of the who was no longer part of the Trump campaign was then.
That's my grandson.
Okay. But the third-hand hearsay about a person who was no longer part of the campaign was accepted immediately as justification to launch a counterintelligence investigation. Presidential campaign. So this is we thought that before, but we didn't have any real definitive answer. That was not clear. Sorry, there's a helicopter going overhead. That
we can still hear you.
It's not the NSA, but we now know definitively how thin that was. And when you look at the Horowitz justification, where he said He could find no documentary evidence of bias, and he could find no testimony of bias, but he did not interview, is my understanding, either Comey or McCabe on some of the classified information. So we're left with this cover story. But when you want to peel this back, and this is what Barr and Durham are referring to, this started as an intelligence operation by the CIA. Its principal target, ironically, initially was Michael Flynn. When Flynn declared for Trump in February of 2016, he became the live wire that they were going to use to truly connect Trump to the Russians. Why? Because Flynn had appeared at a dinner in Moscow, sitting next to Vladimir Putin, I believe it was in December of 2015. Now, what the public does not know or has not been told is that before Flynn accepted that invitation, it was a speaking invitation that came through the agency that was representing him. He went to the Defense Intelligence Agency, as he was required to do, briefed them on what he was going to do, got their approval that he could go and make the speech. Then when the speech was over, he came back and debriefed them on what was said. But the Obama administration hated Michael Flynn, and they hated him primarily because he stopped their war of aggression in Syria. Flynn's DIA, and I know this firsthand, was an honest broker in reporting the intelligence back in 2011 and 2012. He was not a cheerleader. He was honestly reporting what was going on and was raising the important question about, if you get rid of Assad, then what? And Obama and his team saw Flynn as insubordinate, which is ultimately why they fired him, because he would not cook the intelligence for them. And who was sitting at that dinner in Moscow with in the same room with Michael Flynn, none other than Joseph Massoud, who appears later. And Stephen Halper was, I've been told, was the one who was given by the agency the principal task of dirtying Flynn up. So then we move into where Donald Trump starts winning the election, and the intelligence operation to portray Trump as a stooge of Putin starts to swing into motion. Now, one of the fascinating things was that Horowitz says, well, he could find no evidence that confidential human sources were placed inside the Trump campaign. It's odd, though, that he did not, and he justifies that on the fact that he was able to examine the confidential human source files, and there was no information in there on it as far as meeting with their handler, directing them to target Trump. But we know for a fact that at least three other, apart from Christopher Steele, we have this fellow named Greenberg, and then we have Felix Sater. Both were bona fide FBI confidential human sources. Well, the way that that doesn't get reported into FBI files is if they are working on behalf of the CIA, and because there's FBI agents detailed to the CIA task force that John Brennan set up, it's easy to keep them out of the normal bureaucratic paperwork that would flow if they were operating as part of a law enforcement effort or even a counterintelligence investigation run by the FBI. So that's why both Durham and Barr first, and then Durham felt the need to come out and really pull up Horowitz short in trying to at least appear to exonerate the FBI of not having any political bias, and just basically having to use the excuse that they were stupid and incompetent. And we talked about this last week, that the odds were that he would find that sort of legalistic explanation. And he acknowledges, Horowitz does, that the standard for initiating one of these investigations within the FBI was very, very low. You basically, all you had to do was be breathing and they could justify doing it, which is a real problem. So it's going to be about another 6 to 7 months I do expect that we'll see some indictments of some personnel like Kleinsmith maybe within the next month or two. But the grand jury has convened, and it's looking at this as a criminal matter. So I think, the rest of the story is to be told, but what was, as Barbara correctly noted, what was exposed by Horowitz to his credit was gross, widespread abuse by the FBI and spying on an American presidential candidate. The other thing to remember in this is that it's odd that Horowitz didn't ask this question. Not a single person involved in the investigation of Trump and the Trump campaign was a Trump supporter. So the notion that he couldn't prove bias was just, he couldn't find a document or a recorded statement to that fact. So I'll halt there.
Okay, thanks a lot, Larry. Now, in introducing Bill Binney, which I don't have to introduce to some people, I just want to point something out. I think some people here are aware of a film which was made called Citizen 4, and which was done by Laura Poitras and is primarily about Snowden. If you did not see that film, I would recommend you see it. But if you did see it, I want to remind you that at the very beginning of the film, you see someone there who basically is outlining the character of universal surveillance, and that was Bill Binney. And Bill knew how to utilize universal surveillance in a way that would protect the American people, and was denied the option of doing that on behalf of the American people prior to 9/11. 9/11 largely occurred, or was successful in occurring, because of the way in which that process was thwarted. At the point that Bill and his associates attempted to be true whistleblowers against the corruption, minimally corruption, let alone potential collusion that existed among renegade, rogue elements of American intelligence, they instead were raided by the FBI. From that time, Bill has conducted a pretty effective crusade together with the VIPs, Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. But he's here tonight, as he's been with us for many weeks, in that capacity, but other capacities. And I just wanted to say, before he speaks, that we thank him, not just for being with us, being on this, and he was at our conference that we did in February, had an interesting exchange with the Russians there, which was very useful for them. They were very happy about it, because Bill Binney has uniquely stated there was never a Russian hack. And this story is not allowed to actually appear in the international press and national press in the way in which the American people and others need to know it. I just wanted to say that, and also make the observation that much of what we're talking about right now, including the FISA court business and these counterintelligence programs of presidential campaigns, that began with the LaRouche case back in 1982, even before there was an official LaRouche case. Something we'll get to perhaps in questions and answers. And now we'll go to Bill. Go right ahead, and then we'll be opening up the queue for questions and answers and comments. So, Bill.
All right, thank you, Dennis. I basically have always been saying, that all of this Russian hack never happened. But we have some more evidence now coming out recently. I don't know how many. We haven't published it yet. But what we have seen is that there were at least 5 items that we found that were produced by Guccifer 2 back in June the 15th, I believe it was, where they had the Russian fingerprints in them, suggesting the Russians made the hack. Well, we found the same 5 items published by WikiLeaks in the Podesta emails. And those items do not have the Russian fingerprints, which directly implies that Guccifer 2 was inserting these into the files to make it look like the Russians did this hack. And it's very, and taking that into account with all the other evidence we had, like the download speeds from Guccifer 2 were too fast, and they couldn't be managed by the web, and that the files he was putting together and saying that he actually hacked were in fact the two files he said he had were really one file, and that he was playing with the data and moving it into two different files to claim two hacks. So taking that into account with the fabrication of the Russian fingerprints, it leads us back to inferring that, in fact, the Marble framework out of the Vault 7 compromise of CIA hacking routines was a possible user of, in this case. In other words, it looked like the CIA did this, and that it was a matter of the CIA basically making it look like the Russians were doing the hack. And so when you look at that, and then also look at the DNC emails that were published by WikiLeaks that have this FAT file format in them, all 35,813 of these emails have rounded off times to the nearest even second. I mean, that's a FAT file format property. That argues that those files were in fact downloaded to a thumb drive or a CD-ROM and physically transported before WikiLeaks posted them, which again argues that it wasn't a hack. So, you know, all of the evidence we're finding is clearly evidence that the Russians were not in fact hacking. It was probably our own people, you know. And the other problem is that it's very hard for us to get this kind of information out, because the mainstream media won't cover it, and none of them will. It's very hard. I mean, we get some bloggers to do that and some radio shows, but also I put all of this into a sworn affidavit in the Roger Stone case, because I did that because all of the attack on him was predicated on him being connected with this Russian hack, which was false to begin with. And all the evidence we're saying and accumulating clearly says and implies the U.S. government, mainly the FBI, CIA, the DOJ, and of course State Department, all those people involved in this hack and the dossier and all of that information going forward with the FISA court, all of them knew that this was a fake from the very beginning, because this Guccifer 2 character was fabricating it. And they were using him plus the IRA, Internet Research Agency, with the other companies as, quote, supposed trolls of the Russian government. Well, when they sent their lawyers over to challenge that in the court of law, the government failed to prove that they had any connection with the Russian government. And so they basically were chastised by the judge for fabricating a charge against this company. So if you take the IRA and the trolls away from that argument and Guccifer 2, then the entire Mueller report is a fabrication, provable because it's based on Guccifer 2 and the IRA, and then the entire Rosenstein indictment is also a fabrication and a fake and a fraud, again for the same reasons. So and the judges seem to be involved in trying to keep this information out of the public domain. So it's really where we have a really involved, rather extensive shadow government here at work, trying to keep the understanding and knowledge of what's really happening away from the public of the United States. That's the really bad part. And the mainstream media is participant in this. They're culpable. So I'm becoming an advocate that we remove them from the First Amendment of the Constitution, because they're not fulfilling their obligations.
Okay, very good. So thanks a lot, Bill. What we're going to do is open up the queue here.
Q&A session has started. To ask your question, please press *6.
What we want tonight is we want to begin working on solving that problem that Bill just posed of how this actually breaks out, because we're in a situation of breakout that is between what we've got from the Horowitz report, the president's response to it, and otherwise the implications of it all. We've got something much different. I think I've got one person on the line who is an independent journalist, been on RT. He's got a show there called Watching the Hawks, which he co-hosts, and he's got the old show Buzzsaw. and a lot of our people know him. He also was the author of a book called The New World Order, which covers the problem of Brzezinski and Kissinger, that is their father, William Yandell Elliott, and British intelligence. I think he's on. He may have something to say. That's Sean Stone. Sean, are you there?
Yeah, Dennis, I'm here.
Yeah, great. So if you've got any kind of comment on what you've heard or whatever, we're going to let you go first, and then we'll go into some of the other questions and answers we've got already on the line.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think I got on the line too late to hear the full breakdown early on, but I guess for me, what's of interest, because having been part of this Russia investigation since the start, actually, I was at that dinner in Moscow with Putin for RT, which Michael Flynn was at. I wasn't sitting next to Flynn, but, I was there. And so having sort of observed this investigation of the Russians since that time, obviously since the time of Trump's election, it was very clear that there was a lot of fire and a lot of smoke and very little fire behind these charges, and the idea that RT, for example, was one of the means by which the Russians influenced the election, essentially indicated that I was a propaganda agent for the Russians, even by this this report that was put out a few years ago. So it was, basically understood that it was a lot of smoke and very little fire. And I'm just curious to get your reactions on what is now the proper response. At this point, it feels like, the country is now even more divided. And there's certainly a faction that likes to see that likes to see division, that would love to see, internal unrest, civil war type of conditions being fostered. And then certainly there are those that are, obviously they're diehard liberals, and they don't care what the truth is. They're going to hate Trump no matter what. But it's pretty clear at this point how ridiculous this whole impeachment thing has become. So the question is, what is the response? What does Trump do in a sense? Because he's already using words like traitor. I mean, he's using words like traitor against people like Pelosi and others that I know LaRouche and others for many years were no fans of Pelosi. So it's nice to actually see the president saying these things. But what is the proper response now for the president, and how can we, in a sense, not just support him necessarily, but just support this overall unraveling of the deep state and exposure of this corrupt political system that we've obviously known for a long time, but it's becoming more and more evident and apparent thanks to things like this for the ordinary person.
Yeah, look, I think that's obviously that is the central matter that everybody's on here to deal with. I want to say a bit about it, and then I think the speakers may have something to say. This is the concept I am offering. It's not original with me. It comes from really 1974, January, when we were confronted. That is, those of us who were in the LaRouche organization back then were confronted by something we had no idea what it was. Now, Lyndon LaRouche sort of figured out what it was, and this is our first encounter with British intelligence. I won't go through what the particular circumstances were, but essentially we had to create what's today known as the publication Executive Intelligence Review. What it involved, I happen to have been involved in this, was with a lot of students at that time. Won't go through a lot of old nostalgia stories, but there were a bunch of us. We used an apartment. We sort of took all the furniture out and took everything off the wall and started making a series of grids and cross grids to see what we were actually confronted with, because we knew that we didn't understand it. Now, what we've got is that since that time, we're talking about something called an emergency alert system. We've used another term, which is the committees of correspondence. Now, a lot of things can be said, so I just want to stay right on point here. I think that what we know is that when you've got a Bill Binney and you've got something like the archives of the LaRouche organization, and you've got people like yourself, Sean, and others, that there's a capability, and there's also bloggers, there's other people, there's a capability that if we can get a focus specifically on the inflection points that we've seen, not merely 9/11 as such, but also what we're looking at with this whole thing with the president, that there's a way for us to essentially produce on a daily basis increasingly, with increasing lowering of the margin of error. Because, intelligence assessments are largely based on throwing things out that you think are right, but they're not right. They're first passes and you get other things that come in, but then you come by an evaluation, and the evaluation gives you the backstory, the reality. What is the reason that this is going on in this way? And I'm just going to stop there. And I know that was very general. I wanted it to be general because I think the people on the phone are going to have very specific ideas, and then we'll get more into the questions. So let me start. Let me ask Barbara, you first. Let's just go in the same order that we started. Barbara, Larry, and then Bill.
Well, obviously what we're not going to see at this point is exactly what, as Larry referenced, and as Bill Barr said in his statements, criminal proceedings take time. And what we actually, I think, need to do is take the existing corpus of what we know. We have a pretty good idea of what's in the Horowitz report, which I continue to say, despite the way he portrayed it in terms of conclusions and despite the way the media portrayed it, it's very, very clear that the facts in there are pretty devastating as to the FBI and Department of Justice. One, if you've ever dealt with FOIA files from the FBI, you know that there are no admissions anywhere in those files about guilt or bad things. That's mostly all blacked out. And the very fact that what's going on right now is you have an attorney general who is saying he's going to get to the bottom of it, that obviously has freaked out the entire establishment, who's in full-scale attack on Bill Barr personally as being the quote-unquote henchman for Donald Trump. Now, what citizens can do is really what the thing that works, and that Dennis, I think, is trying to get at, is that you always do live intelligence by going out and kicking the tires, so to speak, and basically talking to a lot of people. And there's a lot of people who are involved in aspects of this story or who know parts of it. And we'll actually talk about it. The question is, can we uniformly sort of break the logjam here, where you got people like on the so-called right-hand side, you've got Tucker Carlson, you've got other people who've been involved in this story for quite a while and are right now completely outraged. On the other side of it, you have people who are absolutely determined to stop another war. People like Max Blumenthal and other people like that who don't like Donald Trump, which is fine, but basically know that if Hillary Clinton, which is now being mooted, gets in, we're cooked as together if Michael Bloomberg gets in at this point. So the point is, can we politically organize people who have whole chunks of this story already, and can we organize the same kind of network of people who are willing to come forward from inside and outside and blow the whistle on a lot of the things which we have a directionality on as to where we think the bodies are buried here. And there's been a hell of a lot revealed if you actually think about it already. There's lots of information to be revealed in the Ukraine story. The biggest chunk of that, which hasn't been told and is being avoided, is we've got all sorts of stories about Ukrainian corruption, essentially involving the Yanukovych administration, which was allegedly the pro-Russian administration. That's a lie, but essentially that's how it's characterized. And all these corruption stories about Biden and everything else have to do with the British and American attempts to take over the gas company Burisma. What's lacking is, and what's not been told fully, and which has to be continuously repeated to people, is that the same people, Christopher Steele, Victoria Nuland, all of these people who are involved in the coup from the State Department are the very same people who are now testifying in the impeachment hearings all about how we're fighting a war with the Russians in Ukraine, which is also not true. And what's left out of the story is that these people put neo-Nazis into power in Ukraine. That's what keeps being avoided by every single bit of the congressional investigation and everything else, and that's the story that has to be pounded on because it will result in more important information coming forward about this very network of criminals, which is what they really are, who are behind the present Ukraine gate nonsense. So that's what I have to say. It's active intelligence. You go out, you kick the tires, you see who comes forward. You see, you know, for you guys who have the contacts in the intelligence community, who else is going to reveal stuff at this point about aspects of this stuff? And once it's revealed and you have the story like Bill is talking about, who do we force it through to? Because you have a very, very active and interested Trump campaign at this point who I find wants to find out everything right now about what this was all about. So that's what I have to say.
Great. Larry?
The legal process is going to have to work its way out. I think people have underestimated or don't understand Bill Barr. Bill Barr is the ultimate play-by-the-rules guy, and he's undergone a bit of an evolution since taking office. He didn't come in with any preconceived notions about what had went on, and as he has discovered in the course, as the Horowitz investigation went on, and then as the work that Durham is doing and briefing Barr on, he's literally outraged and furious at what he has seen as this gross abuse and an attempt to destroy this republic. And this, I think you're going to see just an escalation of attacks on Barr over the coming 5 or 6 months, because he represents a genuine threat to the deep state. Trump, for his part, he's staying back and sort of keeping out of it. I mean, he's sending out his tweets and he's trolling various people in the internet, but he's not going to take any kind of overt action that could be used as a justification to accuse him of abuse of power, because he recognizes he's walking through a minefield. But this is, I think it's vitally important that people stay alert, that they read, that they gather that they take the information as it becomes public, because I like to just deal with the facts. What I know factually is, and as Bill talked about earlier, the so-called hack of the DNC was a fabricated story. They knew that the DNC emails had been taken, I think in my view, I think it was taken by Seth Rich. I don't have proof of that direct. We have indirect proof that Julian Assange told people close to him that it was Seth Rich. Julian Assange offered up a reward for information to identify the murderers of Seth Rich. So it's most likely it was Seth Rich. But what we do know is that GCHQ and NSA both were monitoring every electronic communication that was going into the WikiLeaks organization. And it was in that monitoring that they discovered that it was Seth Rich. And that's when, somewhere after May 26th, the CIA began this operation. I do believe that Guccifer 2.0 was a creation of the Brennan Task Force, the Trump Task Force at CIA. And it was designed to further help build this story. And in fact, they include Mueller. They included Guccifer 2.0 as evidence, his quote, evidence that this was a Russian hack. But the other factual thing we know is that there is not one shred of evidence to support the contention that it was the Russians, because the only thing the FBI has is they relied upon what CrowdStrike told them. And we've talked in the past about the fact that there was a 34-day delay between the time that CrowdStrike allegedly discovered that it was the Russians and then when they actually took steps to try to shut the network down. Now, that right there is a gap that is inexplicable for a competent cybersecurity outfit. So you've got that creation, and by being able to immediately start pinning it on the Russians, because you saw that theme was built into the Ellen Nakashima article in the Washington Post on June 14th, and then it was further reinforced by people on the Clinton campaign saying that it was the Russians. So this was an entire buildup, and then when they decided to, with George Papadopoulos providing the alleged foundation for opening this investigation, again, someone who was an obscure 28-year-old with no clout, no influence whatsoever in the campaign, and I think by that point he was out of the campaign, that all of a sudden he becomes the focus of justifying spying on an American president. It is those facts that we have to continue to hammer on. It is those facts that Durham and Barr are pursuing. And as this gets exposed, it's going to be devastating for the FBI. It's going to be devastating for the Central Intelligence Agency. One other tidbit that did come out of the Horowitz report, it was an inadvertent leak, but it was clearly Gina Haspel, the current director of the CIA. She was the one who got the information from Alexander Downer. She then called the FBI legal attaché in London, and then 4 or 5 days later, Peter Strzok goes to London to sit in the CIA in what they call the bubble, and to get a classified briefing to hear what Alexander Downer had to say. And again, Downer was a player in this as well, being a Clinton crony. He had a big stake in the Clinton Foundation, and so he is, we're supposed to believe that he was so alarmed by what he heard from George Papadopoulos on the 6th of May. I mean, he was just so alarmed that he waited 2.5 months to report it to anybody in the U.S. government. I mean, it doesn't even pass the smell test. So I think we've got to continue with some patience to let the legal side of this run its course, because in that lies the salvation of the republic. If not, this country will come apart at the seams.
Okay, Bill, as you answer the question, I'd like you to also address something that somebody texted to me, which is how that is what we can do. Is one of the corollary questions here is how to have security without a surveillance state. You've referred to that before.
Oh, well, that's a fairly straightforward answer to that. It's all based on targeting, using your algorithms to target individuals in the network worldwide based on human behavior. And that falls into basically 3 categories. One is one I call deductive, one inductive, and one abductive approaches to human behavior, which justifies probable cause. In the one case, the deductive one is where you have a social network where you're communicating either directly or indirectly through at least one intermediary to a bad guy. So you're within a zone of suspicion around a known bad guy within the social networking. Now that right away filters out the vast majority of communications of the world. Now you've made the content problem a manageable problem. And the other one is inductive, where you have somebody who's looking at a website repeatedly. That's a site that is involved in terms of building bombs or advocating violence against the West, or any kind of criminal activity like pedophilia. That kind of activity can be shown up to. Or you have cell phones or satellite phones in the mountains of Afghanistan or the jungles of Peru, or things of that nature, properties of an individual or that an individual is using or doing and looking at websites, not necessarily connecting with anybody, but it's an inductive. It's not A to B kind of relationship with deductive. It's the inductive approach, where it's your behavior and the properties of your behavior that make you suspicious. And again, that simply means you're in the zone of suspicion, but not necessarily guilty. And the last one is a little more vague. I call it abductive, where you simply take, for example, the distribution of a community that you're looking at. For example, if there are 4.5 billion people on the network worldwide, then each person has his own network at one degree. Okay, there's a calling community, a banking community, an emailing community, and so on. So you look at that, at those communities, all 4.5 billion, whatever, one at a time, looking at the distribution of where those elements of that community are in the world, and if they just predominantly distribute themselves across countries that are involved in promulgating terrorism, then you need to look at that community to rule it out as a terrorist community. So that property of distribution is one to justify probable cause to look at them from an intelligence point of view, for sure. So those would be the ways. And by the way, the first two, the deductive and inductive way of doing things, would have caught every terrorist attack in the world before, after, and even 9/11, all of them. It would have caught them all because they all demonstrated those properties.
Okay, very good. So there are a lot of other questions. I'm not going to stop all this at all. Matter of fact, there's a lot of people on the line, and we're going to get to you. So we're going to begin to open that up. Sean, you're welcome to stay right there with us. You may also have a comment further. And if there's anything, in fact, I'll come back and ask you in a moment, but I'm going to try to get us started here. I've also got a few text messages. We'll get to those too. All right, are you able to hear us?
Good evening, everyone. This is Jim calling from Michigan, and I really appreciate what you've all stated tonight, because it changes a lot of things in a way I intend to do whatever I can. Excuse me. I'm a homebound person, and I mainly get on the phone and talk to people when I can, or if I have someone take me shopping, I talk to people in the supermarket, etc. And I'd say 1 out of 10 know of LaRouche, and a handful seem to want to take a phone number or get on the website. Now, I call just about every month. I have a talk with Senator Stabenow and Senator Peters staffers, and also Deborah Dingell, the U.S. representative. And to a person, they all are as green as they can be. And they do know about what's going on, but they do lean towards the Intelligence Committee and the Judicial Committee's findings, and they do not want to say anything definite about which way they will vote. But they do give the indication that they all will do what they have to bring Trump down. Now, this changes my question after tonight's dialogue. I had heard one of Mr. Binney's associates had wanted to see a presidential TV channel put up so that the president could address, the population like Franklin Roosevelt did. And my take on it is, I think that would be a good thing if it were a government channel solely run by taxpayer dollars, so there's no interruption from the commercial side, and give each the executive, the judicial, and the Congress opportunities to come out and say all this outright, so the population would be able to make their own determination. Now, right now, based on what Mr. Johnson said about how President Trump is trolling or whatever, he's holding back so he doesn't get called out as being the one who's doing all the attacking. I think if there's a path that can be found to get all this information to Mr. Durham and Mr. Barr, where they could actually call on Mr. Binney, Mr. Johnson, and have a channel opened up for communication to actually get with this organization for interviews, I think that would help a lot in being able to expose, especially the way this organization does show the truth of the matter. So any comments you have on that?
Let me ask if we have one person who will comment, reason being we have a lot of questions, or do we want to just pass and just continue? Anybody have anything?
Well, I've been trying to get what the evidence I have in a court of law and to Durham and everybody in the Department of Justice. The problem is, they seem to be reluctant to take it. Either they don't understand it and will be, they feel inadequate to deal with it, or they just don't want to hear it. And see, that's my problem. So, but I agree. If I could get it into Durham, that would be I would love to do that.
Yes, we're going to continue because I think we may find that there are people that want to help resolve this problem as we go along here. Okay, but thanks a lot for your comments. We're going to go to the next person. Okay, are you able to hear us?
Hi, this is Ann Vandersteel with Steel Truth. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing Bill Binney a few times. In fact, Bill, thank you so much again for joining me at the Fast and Furious press conference, as well as Barbara Boyd, who was recently on the show. This question really goes to the actual future of our intelligence community. I do interface with several people that have been assets and are still assets, this crowd notwithstanding. And there's definitely a value because there's bad actors around the world, and clearly the globalists are still out trying to stake a claim in this piece of property over here called the United States of America. But frankly, it has got such a black eye, and America now is now getting the onion peeled back, and we're all crying. And we're really starting to wake up to just how bad this is and how egregious this usurpation and weaponization of our intelligence community, which has been made the fourth branch of government. How do we recover from this? Is it going to be rolled up? Should it be rolled up under military intelligence? Should we, do away with certain organizations? Or, how do we prevent this from going on again? Because, let's face it, we're human beings, and human beings, unfortunately, are corrupted by power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So I guess, Bill, I'd like to pose this to you first, really. What is this going to look like going forward for the intelligence world? Because we are dependent on it, but we're also become victims of it through human nature.
Yes, I believe I owe you a phone call. See, the real hazard here is that they, and I raised this issue with Pompeo when he was director of CIA, that the intelligence community wasn't telling the truth, in other words, lying to both him and the president. Now, this gets really bad when you think back about weapons of mass destruction and things like the Tonkin Gulf up there, both things that are really false to begin with, and they caused us to get into wars where we killed hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And this is the kind of thing that a bad intelligence community can produce. So they really do need a basic fundamental shakeup where you get these bad actors and you put them, and they really have to be put in jail because for what they're doing. Because if you don't do that, you're not solving the problem. There'll be another crew of clones coming forward like the previous ones, and they'll figure that they can do the same things or they can do similar things, and we'll continue down the bad path. So we really, it's really up to Barr and Durham to change the perspective of the Department of Just Us to the point where it includes every U.S. citizen and everybody. So, and it's up to them to do that, and they can only do that by indictments. No one will buy or believe anything else short of that.
Barbara, you have anything to add?
Sure. I think that it's possible that you could do parallel things along with the judicial proceedings, which clearly can happen, taking a page from the enemy's book here. I think it's very possible that you could do, for example, one of the callers last week talked about, could there be something like a church committee 2.0 at this point? I think that part of what we should be thinking about is what can we do with the Senate Judiciary Committee at this point, which is clearly appalled and quite upset, and I don't think it's fake, about what's gone on right now, and how far can we push them to actually launch whatever parallel investigations or inquiries they can launch, which could, also cause stuff to flow into Barr and Durham, without overlapping. In other words, what happened with the investigation by Mueller is that you had parallel investigations going on in the Senate and the House together with the Mueller investigation, and that created a lot of problems for the putative criminal defendants because they had to figure out how to appear in 3 different forums. And I think that is a nice and delicious thing for the type of stuff that Bill has been talking about in terms of setting examples and seeing what happens.
Go ahead.
I'd like to jump in for a second.
Sure.
I think we need to go back to the fundamental premise. The caller said, well, we need the intelligence community. Why? On what evidentiary basis do you make that conclusion? In fact, I would argue what has happened is it's become a self-licking ice cream cone. The long list of intelligence failures on very important things, including the breakup of the Soviet Union, is the failure with respect to weapons, so-called weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the claim the claim about what was taking place in Syria, the failure to recognize the rise of ISIS as an example. We have a model for the human side that is based upon a Cold War ideology that no longer exists and is no longer relevant, because you recruit case officers whose job is to go overseas and recruit other intelligence officers or people with access to political players. But what's the driving motivation? You're not going to find a terrorist hanging out in those circles. So if the threat is really terrorism, the human intelligence side is completely inept and completely ill-suited to deal with that. As far as what, as Bill knows far better than any of us, the NSA is out sucking up a vast volume of information, including all conversations and electronic communications in the United States. But what are they doing with it? Because you get such a volume of information that unless you go with the kind of program that Bill did build with Thin Thread, which would allow you to carve through all that pile of manure to get down to find the flakes of gold, you've basically just created a system it's a jobs program. And when you start looking at the different contracting companies that are making hundreds of millions of dollars off of providing intelligence services and equipment and information systems to these intelligence entities, and just the simple fact that we have, quote, 17 intelligence agencies out there is just, it underscores what the problem is. The problem is not a lack of information. The problem is we don't even know what it is we're trying to collect and why we're trying to collect it. But then on top of that, we sit here and watch, the latest big lie being told is that Iran is the #1 sponsor of terrorism in the world. That's an objectively false statement. But yet you try to bring that up and you get shouted down. So I think, the best thing that would happen, CIA should be cut 50%. Paramilitary operations that have been part of the agency need to be removed from the agency and put back into the Department of Defense. The NSA needs to be scaled back. We need to have a targeted idea of what we're trying to do, and that doesn't exist right now.
Well, actually, I want to say something in that regard quickly. I think that what we need is a citizens intelligence agency. I think what we need to do is look at the fact that a number of people have left agencies. A lot of people are disgruntled. A lot of them see the fear. They see the corruption. And we also have people who have acted either as journalists, sometimes self-trained, but have come up with various things. I don't know if Sean's still on. He may have a comment, because the other element here is that there's a certain kind of a methodology. And I agree, obviously, with what you said, Larry. It is definitely not a question of information. Intelligence is not information. And in fact, the whole issue of human intelligence and having a conceptual method, of course, we're from the LaRouche organization. We obviously think we have a certain conceptual method, which we learned over time. And we were able to forecast certain things that other people weren't able to forecast. And in various ways. I won't go into that. That's what Lyndon LaRouche did. But that was why for many years back in the 70s, Lynn himself talked to us about the idea of needing to build some form of intelligence academy that would actually take up the study of universal history and actually try to get at this. But I only reference this for the standpoint of going back to the questions. We got a couple of text messages, and I'm just going to put this in, and then we'll go to another questioner. And then I'm going to ask if Sean is still there, if we've answered what he said, what he asked, and also if he has anything to add. But here's what a couple of people have. I'm going to combine some things here. There's a lot of stuff we have tonight. Somebody says we need to organize tribunals in as many cities as possible on the coup and using Bill Binney's evidence. Someone else, same sort of idea. We have people all over the country. If we were to invoke with a single voice, having people call talk shows, intervene in congressional meetings and public political debates, say the truth and demand it be investigated. This is needed to immediately break this story and make it known. President Trump needs to be given the opening to comment on the fake Russian hack. He will pick this up if others do. So we need to do it. No one else will. So those are some comments. There's others. And I know you may all have responses to that, but let me just ask first, Sean, if there's anything you have to say, then I'm going to go back to the phones, if there's not. Okay, I guess he may not be there. So, okay, I'm going to go right back to the phones. All right, are you able to hear us?
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to go back to what Jim said from Michigan. And I
Who is
know that this is not Brandon from Ludington.
Okay.
And this is not the activism call. This is the update call. But we have a meeting in Ludington on January the 11th. So if there's any further questions about that, I would advise to contact Anastasia or Susan. So that's all I have.
Okay, fine. Let's just go to the next one. Thank you. Okay. All right. Are you able to hear us?
Hello? Yeah, hi. This is Steve from Florida.
Okay.
I have a few observations, and I'm not really formally part of the LaRouche organization, but I am 100% a supporter of Trump. And I have some affiliation, or at least knowledge, of how some of the world works. And the first thing I'd comment on is I think the world is made up of puppets and puppet masters. And it's easy to get confused and think that the puppets are the ones that are running the show. It's really the puppet masters, and they're harder to identify. When you get right down to it, this whole anti-Trump thing has been generated primarily out of the CIA and John Brennan. And you have to ask, what's his motivation? He has the ties, if you will, with the British intelligence service, with the Steeles of the world, with the rest of them. He was able to generate whatever kind of intelligence he wanted to gin up. He had a lackey in the DNI, in Clapper, who is just a politician. He's the only DNI that lasted more than 6 months in that position. And he managed to last through several administrations by being an astute politician. When you talk about all these agencies, my guess is that when Clapper said something about all of them agreed about Russian collusion, he was talking for himself as the head of the DNI. I doubt if he ever talked to any of those agencies. But the bottom line is it's John Brennan that really was out to get Trump, and it's not because he hated Trump. My point of view on all of this is people are motivated by either money or power. And in this particular case, it was power. For many administrations, the CIA ran foreign policy. You had presidents in there that were pretty inept when it came to foreign policy. They were primarily domestic agents, if you will. They had domestic policies. They ran on domestic policies. They were elected and reelected on domestic policies. And what happened is the CIA became the de facto instigator of U.S. foreign policy. And when Trump comes in there and says right up front that he doesn't need the CIA daily briefing every day because it's boring, and that he'll listen to them, but he won't necessarily act on what they say, that is a direct threat to their power.
Okay, let them answer. Let's let people answer what you had to say. Okay, so
just a couple other quick points. I do agree.
No, you can't do a couple other quick points because there's like another 5 people on the line.
Right,
so if we
go ahead.
It's okay. Just let's see if somebody wants to respond.
All right.
Okay. If Brennan was not running things, it was Clapper. Brennan was an eager and enthusiastic participant. Part of it was because he had promises from Hillary about what his next job would be. They did see Trump as a threat, particularly with his comments early on in the campaign regarding NATO, wanting to get the United States out of NATO, and wanting to get the United States out of Syria. The CIA, I know that in sort of popular fiction, the CIA gets this reputation for being this incredibly powerful, competent organization. It's full of more buffoonery than anything. The only thing they're good at is convincing Hollywood that they're good. But the reality is, it's a very big bureaucracy, and they're very much designed to serve sort of who the political masters will be at the time. But in that regard, I think you're right about the money. Money plays the money is a major factor here. Particularly, that's why Ukraine is now the center of U.S. foreign policy, supposedly, according to all these State Department diplomats that showed up. Oh my God, they're at the front line of protecting us from Russia. The amount of money that's flowing from Ukraine into both, Lindsey Graham and to Mitt Romney, and to John McCain's foundation, and to the Democrats through Hunter Biden, it was a lot of money. And so the money, and from that standpoint, is a key. But it's sort of more it's more craven. It's not some big bold vision of the world. It's just basic greed, a way that people feel that they can line their pockets and take care of their buddies and people who play along.
Okay, let's go. Let's continue. Okay, are you able to hear us? Hello?
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, good. I actually just, this is sort of a response, but people may have something to say in response to this. Oh, Diane in New Jersey. Diane's there. The part of what pulls the strings, I'm afraid, is the culture that people have succumbed to over the last 50 years, particularly since the Kennedy assassination, the Warren Commission cover-up, 9/11, the cover-up of that, and people, because of fear and behavior modification, have allowed themselves to tolerate a very degraded view of man. So when you have something which is clearly offensive, like Obama, it's admitted in the New York Times that he's holding kill sessions where he's deciding who he's arbitrarily killing with drones, and that's not considered a crime against humanity or a violation of natural law, then I think we have to look at how we think that we could allow such a thing, because you can't point at a particular person, but the culture as a whole. And I think there's been a particular turning point. The fact that Trump has been willing to fight, as Lyndon LaRouche fought, is reminding people that this is not an acceptable standard. So I think that's really important. That's why the Kavanaugh case went the way it did, as opposed to being a disaster. It was sort of a turning point because people are picking up on this question of fighting. But I think we have to look very much at ourselves and the culture we've tolerated, and maybe people have some comments on that.
Anybody? Okay. What we can do is people can think about it. We'll go to the next question. And, okay, because there's a lot of other people here. Let's see what we have. All right. Are you there? Can you hear
Hello,
me?
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, it's more of an observation than a question. I've always had the impression...
Who's calling, please?
I'm sorry, Ted Holden, Victoria, Texas.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Okay, this is the observation. I've always had the impression that John Kennedy was on particularly bad terms with the CIA and meant to get rid of it. And I believe he created the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIAC, it's over there in Anacostia, right? And, what I thought was one of the beauties of DIAC is that you were probably going to get, like ordinary military officers rotating through the place, on the normal 3 or 4 year rotation scheme, so that no one person would ever stay there long enough to turn into some kind of a total squirrel like John Brennan or G. Gordon Liddy. That may be part of the answer. Maybe the idea is you really want to get rid of the CIA and just let the Defense Intelligence Agency be your intelligence agency, right? I mean, the American people really do trust the military more than they trust these spook agencies.
Okay.
Does that seem to make sense?
Any response? Who wants to respond? Larry, you have something? Go ahead.
Let me.
Barbara wants to go first.
I think the problem comes back to accountability, and competence. I mean, the problem we have right now is that for years there has been no, as Bill and Larry have been saying, there has been no accountability for things which were strategic disasters for the United States and killed millions of people. It's as simple as that. And the same people who did these things keep being promoted and keep their jobs and keep being essentially sponsored in official Washington with absolutely no consequences. So there's no calling to account, if you will, for not just incompetent decisions, but for truly evil decisions. And that's where I think you have to basically, that's why, both of them are saying people have to go to jail for this, because you have to break the culture. You have to be very tough and break the culture. You have to demand accountability and competence in terms of what you're actually looking at. I think that, in just reflecting on it overall, what Larry has raised is the central issue. Why exactly? What is the mission that we're trying to undertake here?
Yeah.
What is the mission, and how is it executed, and how is it executed competently, and who are the people who actually have the skills to staff that mission? What's their training and what's their intellectual development? That's the issue.
But I'd still like to see the CIA gotten rid of. My impression of the CIA was formed in those Watergate hearings where you saw a procession of 7 or 8 CIA types, and they were all clowns. It was just frightening to watch. You kept thinking that the guy you were listening to had to be the biggest clown on the face of the earth, and sure enough, the next guy up was always the bigger clown.
Well, I think, look,
we'll accept that. Let's get another answer. Go ahead.
One of the things you're overlooking is that that part of the CIA, the Directorate of Operations, their job is to go out ostensibly overseas, recruit foreigners who will give us information to convince other people to betray their country. There used to be a wall between the operations side of the house and the analytical side of the house. And the analytical side of the house used to actually do a pretty good job. That's where, Ray McGovern came out of that side. I was there during the Contra War, and what I got to see firsthand was when you've got a president heavily invested into a policy, in this case the war against the Sandinista regime, that the Directorate of Operations, in trying to carry out that policy, would put enormous pressure on the analysts to try to tailor their message so as not to affect that policy. And they would go as far as to withhold information that analysts should have had that would have put a more clear picture on what was going on. What has happened in the last 20 years is that wall has been erased, the analysts have been absorbed in most cases into these operational units like the Counterterrorism Center, the Counter-Narcotics Center, the Counter-Proliferation Center. And invariably, once the analysts are working that close with the operations side of the house, there's a natural tendency to shape and shade the message. They don't really tell the truth. So the DIAC, and again, in my experience, the Defense Intelligence Agency did an excellent job in reporting accurately what was the situation on the ground. They do a great job with military intelligence. They don't do a good job in some other areas, and so there is, I think there's a need for both the two elements, the military and the civilian side, but it has to be, you've got to get the politics out of it, and that's where the agency, because it has been allowed to become an operational arm of foreign policy, whether it was in Libya, whether it was in Syria, and these other places, it's not with a very defined purpose, and the politics invariably end up taking over. So you've got to try to get the politics out of it. That's critical for me.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, sir. We're going to now go to one other thing we've got, which is in the text messages. Somebody wants to know if it would be important for you to address Trump's meeting with the Russian minister discussing nuclear disarmament right in the middle of the impeachment proceedings and the question of war and peace. I think the idea is, what do you guys think about what happened? I think you probably followed it, and who would like to respond on that?
Is that you're asking us, Dennis?
Yes, right. This is the text.
Well, yeah. I mean, it goes to the insanity of the media, because on the one hand they're pushing the meme that Russia's our enemy, ignoring the fact that the Russians and us are sharing the space station. The Russians carry us to the space station. They're basically our Lyft and Uber driver. So there are all these other areas where we share interests on a daily basis. In Syria, we're coordinating with the Russians, deconflicting airspace. So this notion that the Russians are some sort of implacable enemy is just, it's a lie. It's perpetuated by the media, and yet when you can get in behind the curtain where the actual business goes on of dealing with the Russians on arms control, dealing with the Russians on issues of terrorism, we find the Russians have been cooperative. In fact, they tried to warn us about the Tsarnaev brothers and
that's right.
They carried out the Boston Marathon bombing, and we ignored them. So this is, I think it's to the credit of the Trump administration, they're trying to have some sort of normal relationship with the Russians, a much-needed relationship, and yet anything that they do that it was going to promote goodwill between the two countries is being attacked, that this proves that Trump is a tool of the Russians. I mean, it is utter insanity.
Yeah, Bill, I think you were saying something.
No, I was just agreeing with what Larry was saying there. Mm-hmm. I mean, especially about the terrorism. I mean, they've been trying to help us with terrorism on a number of cases. I mean, the Tsarnaev was just one of them. I mean, I've been amazed at how stupid our entire foreign policy has been, all along. I mean, and that's basically, these are the people who are fighting Trump. They're the ones, because he can't be controlled. They don't control him. He doesn't owe them anything. He doesn't owe them politically anything. He's not a politician. He doesn't owe them money. I mean, he doesn't need money from them. So, he's really something and someone they fear because they can't control him.
Okay. Barbara, you have anything, or should we continue?
No, I think that's correct. I don't think that we actually know a lot about what went on here, but it is exactly as people are saying. What's happening here is that issues of war and peace, the possibility of actually settling things up and creating the type of vision of the world that Mr. LaRouche envisioned in the Strategic Defense Initiative and joint development of the world, all of the stuff which is sane and rational, is being compromised and indeed creating new threats by this craziness around this Russia Gate myth and now the Ukraine Gate myth. I mean, think about it. You have this guy Zelensky, he just got elected, and already he's having to compromise with neo-Nazis and back down off of commitments he may be making for peace because the President of the United States can't do what would be rational, which is to say, hey, we created a mess and we got your back, and, you know, these guys are not going to control what happens in Ukraine. There's a way out for peace. That creates a real threat of potential warfare. So it's not this political arena which is being portrayed in the impeachment. It is indeed a very threatening situation if you think about it for 10 seconds, where the President of the United States is being constantly delegitimized. And instead, these people are continuing to run things to the extent that he is delegitimized. So that's really the issue of the impeachment.
Right. People need to think about the North Korean theater, the Syrian theater, the Afghanistan theater, and then and Ukraine from the standpoint of Russia on the border of Ukraine. So you have an entirely, I'm reminded actually of Lyndon LaRouche's analysis, Storm Over Asia, where he described precisely this situation. And in the contrast to this, the president's policy, which is let's work with China, let's work with Russia, and what that would mean from the standpoint of reallocating the actual resources of the United States toward peace. Okay, what we're going to do here is this. There are several other questions online, but we are pretty much running up on time, and we've got to do summaries of everyone. So I'm going to take two of the people who are on. There are quite a few people who are on, and maybe I'll try for three. I see there's a lot more people jumping in, probably because they heard we're at the end. So we'll try to run through this. So, okay, everybody, cooperate with us because we don't have a lot of time, but we're going to try to get you in. Okay. All right, are you able to hear us?
Hey, this is Rachel from Memphis. I had interesting phone calls. I've been calling members of Congress about the impeachment, but then also as other stuff was popping up, especially like the Senate just advanced a bill where the State Department can designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. I mean, the Congress has gone off the cliff of any sort of rationale, which is unbelievably terrifying. And so I was wondering if anybody has had any interesting conversations with any legislative aides as far as, the issues with the impeachment, bringing up our nefarious activities in Ukraine or our demonization of China. Those are some of the topics that I've kind of pushed with whomever I was speaking with at different offices. And I wanted to get y'all's thoughts on that, because I think what's being missing with this whole the huge anti-China propaganda on the Uyghurs is the whole Belt and Roads. It centers on was it Xinjiang? I can't think of the. I'm going blank on Xinjiang. Yes, and how that whole other warmongering propaganda is being pushed, in conjunction with Russia. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, let me do the following. I'm going to do something here because actually your question were best answered on Monday, where we actually have the activists and the people who are doing a lot of the congressional and related work. But I will say the following, and if someone wants to add something, we'll see, but just for the interest of time, that the issue concerning many of these disinformation campaigns, and everything is not merely disinformation, sometimes there are real issues involved in these things. The conception around, you mentioned the Belt and Road. The LaRouche organization had a lot to do with that policy, that is the actual discussion of that policy between 1993 and 1996-97, which is when it actually originated. It's not that we invented the policy per se. We invented a version of the policy. The Chinese also had a version of the policy. The interesting thing to think about is that when the Schiller Institute was created, it was created as a foreign policy conception, which Helga Zepp LaRouche was offering to the U.S. State Department, and it was rejected. And her idea was, at the time, look, we've got to look at trying to intervene and intersect countries at the highest level of their best elements of their culture. We know there are problems. We know there's all sorts of diplomatic, political, and other, and also ethnic problems in a lot of places. But we've got to try to address people from a more advanced standpoint. I think on the particular that you asked concerning the congressional side, that might be better taken up, other than to say that I'm glad you're doing the work to try to reach out to them. That's very important. There are 31 or maybe even 57 swing congressional districts among Democrats in the United States. In other words, there's more Democrats than are being said who don't want to go with impeachment. So the more work we do of that type, the better. So I think what I'm going to do, given the time, is let that be the answer unless anybody urgently thinks they got to say something more, and then move on. Okay, somebody's saying anything, so we're going to move on. Thank you for the question, and just to ask that you give a call in on Monday, we can discuss it more. All right, I'm going to go to number 2. All right, go ahead. Can you hear us?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you. Hello, Omar, New York. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I'm going to make it quick and brief as possible. 50 years from now, you said to conceptualize the future. What, funds-wise, is there anything that can be, any projects or anything that can be funded to get, our kids or people on like after-school programs or such, like science programs of some sort, so that people are distracted by like the Hollywood garbage or Greta Thunberg being named Time Person of the Year, or appropriate publication? Any like projects that can be funded or anything going on that we can let people know about, so that
I'm going to try to restate this. So that it makes. I think the conception here is we have to think about the future. Our problem is that we have people involved in a lot of things they shouldn't be involved in. What might be done? What kind of programs might be proposed that we could actually change that? I'm going to ask my rephrasing. I'm going to refer it to Barbara, see if she has something to say.
Well, I think that's basically everything that we're attempting to do through the community chorus program and through the various class series, and it also is implicit in the mobilization around what we're talking about is the absolute need for a crash program for fusion energy and a space program. If people recall the mobilization in the United States around Sputnik, that was not for the best of purposes, but nonetheless it was a huge mobilization of the entire nation on a mission to ultimately put mankind on the moon. We need that type of national mission, but we can't really go for it as a national mission with the president, again, constantly being compromised. So he's made a proposal. It's called the Artemis Program. It is exactly of the character which you could mobilize an entire country on and vastly upgrade everything we're doing. When we did the space program, essentially the technological spin-offs in our industries and everything else accounted for our capacity to actually have an economy during that entire period. And that's what we need to do as a nation right now, and it's that very lack of a national mission like that, which sort of, on the scale of a national mission, which keeps all of the decadence which Hollywood throws at people going, so to speak. So that's sort of the answer I would give.
I think I just throw in that actually a lot of what we were talking about with respect to the cyber capabilities and so on would be properly discussed, properly made the topic of negotiation among China, Russia, and the United States, were that under the cooperation in the space program. And certainly that would lead to also a greater cooperation on things like space, certainly terrorism, the surveillance there, the drug issue, which is involves a lot of things on satellite and related capability and so on. And that need not be, as someone asked before, that doesn't have to be intrusive or invasion of privacy. It doesn't have to be like that. So I'll just reference that as well. So we're going to go now to our final question, and then we'll take summaries from the panel. All right, are you able to hear us? Hello? Hello? Cannot hear you. I guess we're not going to be. Are you able to hear us? Because we can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now.
Okay, good. Roger from Baltimore. One of my concerns is we are acting in the parameters of, human investigation, human activities, doing what normal people do. Now we're facing an enemy that is acting in non-human activities, and I'm just wondering if all the proper precautions are taken to keep people safe during all this. If Barr is going to take, several months, by September or by June to bring all this to his investigations to fruition, but the impeachment process is going ahead right now. If something progresses in their favor and they do impeach, carry out some sort of impeachment process, would that be nullified after Barr's investigations are exposed? Or, again, the worst scenario, of course, is keeping people safe. Could anybody comment on that? I don't want to throw a wet towel on anything, but this is after going through the last 50 years and seeing what's happened, this is a major concern of mine. I'm done now.
Yeah, I think we get what you're asking about. Some people have been raising this also today. I'll just say vague references because of some possibilities that this apparently the president said something about Judaism being a nationality, and then some people were talking about the possibility of an Arab-based cover of a hit, etc. So there's a certain anxiety that's out there. So I guess I'll ask if anybody of the three of you wants to say anything about that at all.
Well, I don't know if you looked at the Senator Stevens case where they found malicious prosecution on the part of the government. In fact, keeping exculpatory data and information away from the defense and so on, just highly irregularities that would have reversed everything. But in the end, he lost his Senate seat, and that was the whole objective of the Democrats to do that. And nothing was reversed after that. So that's a definite fear.
The only thing I would say about that is there's a concept called factitious advantage. And, what that depends upon for the president is the penalty of citizens actually letting the other side know that doing such a thing ultimately will have a worse result for them. And that depends upon people actually recognizing, just like you're recognizing, what the situation is, but also acting on it to build a political movement which is absolutely viable among citizens that makes it very clear to these guys that there's a price to pay which is greater than that which they're willing to sacrifice, and that's what factitious advantage is all about. It's the only way that you can keep people alive in a situation like this is by citizens like yourself being extremely active.
Yeah, I'd like to actually use this as an opportunity for people to do summary statements into putting it like this. We talked about something called an emergency alert service. At least I brought that up, and that's something that we're doing at Executive Intelligence Review. That's what the LaRouche movement is doing. And I posed the idea of the notion of a citizen's intelligence capability. And all this, so if you look at it, obviously people have heard it said before that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. Well, it may be the price of survival right now. But, of course, the idea is that we get together and we've talked about the idea of human intelligence, live intelligence, operations. We've said many things. But we also, I think, and just like I ask everybody to sort of respond to this, is as we begin to do this fight, And as we watch what's coming out of Washington, what would be your recommendations, apart from the particulars of what we're in? How do you think people should look at this? I know that, for example, Bill has talked about the idea of freeing the nation and freeing the world, for that matter, from the clutches of these people who basically believe they know better how to run people's lives. Larry has clearly said some things already about what the actual functions of an intelligence agency are, and Barbara's said things. We've talked many times here about the ideas of economy and economic development, and what the Earth's next 50 years should look like. So I'd like to ask all three of you. Maybe we'll start with let's start with Larry. Let's go then to Bill and then to Barbara. That how would you say that this battle, properly fought, will contribute to providing a way forward for the United States? Let's say as we go into we're about to celebrate our 250th anniversary when we get to 2026, and we're looking at also the next decade. So how do you think a hard-fought and won victory in what we're talking about actually changing? How do you think that would affect this country? So Larry, let's start with you. Let's go to Bill, and then from there.
So the key is the information and educating the citizenry, and to the extent that you can continue raising this issue to inform people, and then as that takes place, the government is going to, a heavy weight is upon the shoulders of Bill Barr and the Department of Justice. They either will restore the faith of the American people that this system of justice that we have is truly blind and doesn't look at people in terms of their economic status, in terms of their racial background, before deciding whether they're going to give them a fair decision. And holding people accountable for crimes is essential. We've had a system that if you're poor and if you're black, it's easy to hold you accountable. But those who are wealthy and well-connected, as we saw in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, as we've seen in the case of the Clinton Foundation, as we're witnessing with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, that the system seems skewed to protect those who are in the inner circle. I think this is what Barr's going after. This is where I'm placing a lot of faith and hope that his genuine outrage at what he's seen by these people who've abused the system, getting that accountability in tandem with educating the American public, give us some hope for maybe getting things restored to a place where we're going to stop being driven by fear of terrorism to justify a surveillance state, and instead go back to the foundations of this republic, which recognize our system is based upon a distrust of government, that the government is not all powerful, that the rights of the individual are superior and supreme to the right of the mass. And this value of the individual is what has set America apart, despite all of its problems and all of its flaws, is why still to this day, I've got several friends who came out of Central America, and in those societies, they couldn't get ahead. They could not make a life for themselves. They come to the United States, and they do landscaping. They clean houses. They do a variety of low-level jobs, but they end up building businesses and become business owners, and then they have a stake in this country. And I think it goes back to making sure that everybody has some skin in the game, and that they know that the game is not rigged against them. That's what we're facing.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Bill?
Well, I just think the issues are primarily informing making sure we have an informed electorate and an informed population, so they make a decision based on knowledge and understanding that's true, and not the fabrication that we're getting from the mainstream media and basically from the Democrats and the distortions that they're making out that our Constitution has. I mean, this is the fundamental problem I see, that people, if you keep the electorate uninformed, then you can manipulate them any way you want. And especially if you're collecting all this data on them, that makes it a lot easier to manipulate them and direct their thinking in certain ways. That's what they're doing with our leadership in this country. That's the whole point of what I was trying to get at Pompeo and the president, that you cannot accept these fabrications and lies from your intelligence community, because they'll direct you to make certain kinds of decisions that won't end up, as we have basically seen over the last n number of decades since World War II. They haven't ended up in good results. And if we don't keep this, if we don't enforce this and make sure that we're informed properly, and if they don't inform us, and I include the mainstream media in this, if they don't include us properly, there have to be consequences, and there has to be accountability here, or we're never going to get anywhere, really.
Okay, very good. So, Barbara.
Yeah, I think that it comes back to I endorse what both of you have just said. I think it does come back to citizens really aspiring to become involved at this point in a way which they haven't been involved for a long time. Look, essentially what we had in 2016 was a revolt within the citizenry against all of these things which now we're encountering. The citizens revolted. They said, we're not going to take this anymore. It was a hidden revolution of sorts. The problem is that you can't really progress forward by being against stuff. You have to have a positive program for development. You have to have a positive program for economic development. The president clearly has some of that, but he needs to really have his citizens educated on what the American system of political economy actually is. People have to figure out what American history actually is, which has largely been taken away from any modern classroom in the United States. People don't know who Alexander Hamilton is or was. They don't recognize that he invented a form of economy which had never been done in the world before. It is not the Wall Street form of capitalism. It is a completely different notion of the use of credit for fundamental infrastructure, for fundamental technological advance, coupled with a private economy and private efforts to go in the same direction on a national mission, in which all citizens are raised to a certain equal level of economic productivity. So what we have to do is we have a big educational job ahead of us, but what I find is that the people out there, precisely because there's a large segment of the population which is in revolt, is they're very open to being educated, and they're thirsty for the kind of knowledge which can actually allow them to act rationally in this situation. And that's really what I think the challenge is for people who are on this call. So that's how I would end it.
Okay. I'd just like to say I want to thank you all for what you've done and what we've been able to present to people. I want to invite everybody to work with us on this idea of our emergency intelligence service. I know there are a lot of people who are on, several people who are bloggers themselves. Some people are interviewers. Some people are just activists in various capacities. There are some students on. And I'd like to just close with this. There was an American by the name of Ben Franklin, who was the greatest scientist of the 18th century, known for his experiments in electricity, even recognized by the Royal Society for the same, and who traveled to Paris in particular as the representative of the American Revolution. He was known as the man who tamed the lightning. He wasn't merely known as some backwoodsman or something like that. He was, of course, the intellectual author of the revolution from the time that he was about 16 years old and sent to Philadelphia by the Mather family for that express purpose. He worked on that project from 1722 until 1776. Sometimes it takes that long. But what happened as a result was that he created a group of very, very educated, helped to create a group of very, very educated people known as the Latin farmers, because they read Latin and often spoke Latin. They were the most educated population in the world at that time. They had a rate of literacy over 40% in comparison to London's, over 90% compared to London's 40%. It's that America that Ben Franklin founded, and of course made the famous statement in answer to the question, what kind of government you've given us? A republic if you can keep it. That's what we intend to do, and that's what we'll be able to do. The conception is republicanism with a small r. But the idea is that we can, in fact, live up to that tradition, which is the American revolutionary ideal and tradition. America is an idea above being a place, and it's our place now to live up to that idea. So I want to thank everybody for being with us. On behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to encourage you all to continue to do the work that we're doing. Help us do it in various ways. Stay in touch with us. There'll be another conference call for the activists on Monday, and we'll see you here again next Thursday.
This session is no longer being recorded. Goodbye.